By 1932, Roosevelt was recognized as the nation's most prominent liberal Democrat. Unlike the passive Hoover, he recognized the Depression as the greatest crisis since the Civil War. The unemployed were not slackers, as Hoover implied, but victims of complex and impersonal forces over which they had no control. He called on states and the federal government to create work relief programs, unemployment insurance, and old age pensions. In addition to Harry Hopkins, a social worker who had headed a New York State agency that hired the unemployed to work on public projects, and Eleanor, FDR relied for ideas on three academic lawyers and economists from Columbia University: Raymond Moley, Rexford Tugwell, and Adolph Burrell. They all advocated increased regulation of business and greater government economic planning to salvage capitalism. Journalists called them the Brain Trust. After Roosevelt secured the Democratic presidential nomination in the summer of 1932, he spoke of rebuilding the economy from the bottom up by helping the forgotten man. He pledged to use federal power to ensure a more equitable distribution of income and promised bold experimentation in pursuit of what he called a New Deal. On November 8, 1932, Roosevelt trounced Hoover, winning nearly 58% of the popular vote, or 22.8 million to 15.7 million. The challenger received 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59, winning all but 6 states. Democrats took control of the House by a margin of 310 to 117, and the Senate by 60 to 35. Roosevelt's landslide victory signaled hope, but no quick change. Nearly everything got worse between November 1932 and the inauguration in March 1933, including the weather. A drought that already afflicted the Upper South spread west into Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Texas, carving out what would soon be known as the Dust Bowl. Hoover, now a lame duck, spent the time from November through March calling on the president-elect to endorse his discredited economic policies. But Hoover had lost all credibility. What remained of the banking system virtually collapsed in January and February of 1933. There were about 25,000 banks in the U.S. at the onset of the Depression. Many were small institutions with limited assets and couldn't survive the downturn without an infusion of cash from the Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department. About 5,000 small banks failed before the 1932 election, and another 5,500 went under by March 1933. Since deposits were not insured and ordinary Americans had no idea which banks to trust, early in 1933, small savers rushed to withdraw billions of dollars from their accounts. This escalating panic threatened to bring down even large, well-managed banks. When Hoover refused to intervene, most state governors imposed bank holidays. They ordered banks to shut their doors to prevent mass withdrawals and inevitable collapse. By March 4th, 32 states had suspended all banking activity, and the economy was paralyzed. Hoover's outgoing Secretary of the Treasury, Ogden Mills, told a banker friend planning a trip to the Bahamas, "Don't buy a round-trip ticket. When you return, there will be nothing worth returning to." Like most of his advisors, Roosevelt came of age in the Progressive Era and saw government as a positive force to mitigate the excesses and inequalities of the new industrial order. He believed the government could help preserve individual liberty and enhance opportunity. But New Dealers often disagreed among themselves on details of policy. Some favored balanced budgets, while others insisted that running deficits promoted growth. Some advocated central economic planning, others retained faith in free markets. One group of New Dealers urged redistributing wealth to those at the bottom of the economic pyramid, while others insisted that government could help the poor most effectively by promoting overall growth. New Dealers generally sympathized with the efforts of workers to organize unions, but hesitated to intervene on their behalf. Most New Dealers agreed that underconsumption by poorly paid workers and farmers, along with selfish actions by financial institutions, had caused the Depression. Recovery would require active federal regulation of capital markets, assistance to farmers and businesses, and increased government spending to boost production and consumption.
Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men. True, they have tried, but their efforts have been cast in the pattern of an outworn tradition. Faced by failure of credit, they have proposed only the lending of more money. Stripped of the lure of profit by which to induce our people to follow their false leadership, they have resorted to exhortations, pleading tearfully for restored confidence. They only know the rules of a generation of self-seekers. They have no vision, and when there is no vision, the people perish. Yes, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truth. The measure of that restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values, more noble than mere monetary profit. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy, the moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase of evanescent profit.
Moments after taking the presidential oath, FDR invoked emergency powers to issue a proclamation closing all national banks effective Monday, March 6th. He then called Congress into a special session on March 9th. In less than a day, the president persuaded Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This created a system to audit, loan funds to, and reopen banks under Treasury Department supervision. On the evening of March 12th, Roosevelt explained the procedure to an anxious public in a 14-minute radio address, the first of 36 fireside chats he delivered on policy issues over the next 12 years. Half of all American adults listened to the president as his aristocratic and reassuring voice described the causes of the banking crisis, the procedures to audit and reopen sound banks, and how regulators would safeguard future deposits. In June, Congress enacted the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which established strict guidelines for banking operations and expanded the power of the Federal Reserve System. The law closed many small banks and forced several thousand others to merge with larger, more stable institutions. It also separated risky commercial and investment banking from ordinary banking, a firewall that lasted until 1999. The new Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, helped restore faith in banks by guaranteeing individual deposits for up to $5,000, an amount raised gradually over time. The new administration also moved quickly to prevent the kind of wild speculation that led to stock market booms and busts. The Securities Act of 1933 required companies selling stock to the public to register with a federal agency and provide accurate information on what was being sold. The subsequent Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created a Securities Exchange Commission, otherwise known as SEC, which has nothing to do with college football, to regulate stock markets and activities by brokers. As with banking reform, this left the basic operation of capital markets in private hands, but imposed rules and supervision over market operations. Between March and June, often dubbed the first 100 days, Roosevelt prevailed on Congress to pass 14 major pieces of legislation, a record never duplicated and a testament to both presidential leadership and the country's desire for change. Congress enacted bills to raise agricultural prices, put the unemployed to work, regulate the stock market, reform banking practices, and assist homeowners and farmers in paying mortgages. Telling aides he felt it was a good time for a beer, Roosevelt convinced Congress to amend the Volstead Act to allow production of beer and wine, while the states went through the long process of ratifying the 21st Amendment that repealed the 18th Amendment mandating prohibition. Except for the Economy Act, which modestly cut the salaries of federal workers and veterans' pensions, all the new legislation expanded the size, scope, and spending of the federal government. This burst of energy fulfilled FDR's promise of bold, persistent experimentation. As journalist Walter Lippmann observed, "In the 100 days, we became again an organized nation, confident of our power." To meet the challenge of youth unemployment, Congress created the Civilian Conservation Corps. Within a few months, it enrolled 275,000 men, mostly in their 20s, in 1,300 labor camps across the country. They received $30 per month, plus room and board, and had to send $22 home to their families. Because Army officials organized the initial CCC efforts, critics worried it might resemble the Hitler Youth indoctrination camps established by the Nazis. But in fact, they had little in common and did not delve into politics. In 1935, at its peak, 500,000 men worked on CCC projects. By the time the program ended in 1942, about 3 million men had served. Besides good pay and wholesome meals, volunteers received literacy and vocational training. In addition to conservation work, the CCC constructed the infrastructure of the national park system. Other New Deal innovations included the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. FARA, headed by Harry Hopkins, began with a $500 million appropriation to provide matching funds to states to hire the unemployed to work on public projects. PWA, managed by Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, spent more than $3 billion in the first 3 years building large public works projects such as dams in the Pacific Northwest, highways, and public buildings. TVA represented a vast experiment in regional planning. It built a network of dams and hydroelectric projects to control floods, generate power, and promote growth in chronically poor areas of the South. Cheap electricity generated by TVA dramatically improved life for millions of Southerners, and it still plays a major role in the region. The National Industrial Recovery Act created the National Recovery Administration, famous for its Blue Eagle logo. The NRA resembled World War I programs that brought together industry leaders and labor groups to boost production. NRA wrote production codes for each industry that encouraged cooperation among competing businesses to set stable prices and wages and bar cutthroat competition. Roosevelt hoped these measures would stabilize the economy and prompt private business to hire more workers, but neither occurred, and the NRA failed to address the biggest impediment to recovery, which was the lack of new private investment funds and the large pool of unemployed workers who lacked the money to buy goods. In 1935, the Supreme Court declared NRA an unconstitutional overreach of federal authority, and it came to an end. Despite NRA's defeat, the New Deal writ large addressed both immediate problems and long-term needs. In an economy dominated by powerful business interests, New Dealers hoped to mitigate concentrated corporate power by creating what economists called countervailing powers. For example, industrial labor unions could balance the influence of big business and promote workers' welfare. Electric power generated by government-built dams in the Tennessee Valley and Pacific Northwest and distributed by consumer-owned cooperatives would compete with private utilities and pressure them to improve service and reduce rates. New agencies to regulate banking and the stock market would empower private investors to take informed risks and small depositors to put their money in banks where it could be loaned out to promote economic expansion. Government-administered pensions funded by workers' and employers' contributions would provide the elderly a decent retirement and make them less dependent on the whims of their employers. Agricultural subsidies to farmers would provide a cash flow that made them less vulnerable to market blips or the power of large food processors. Roosevelt once told Labor Secretary Francis Perkins, "We're going to make a country in which no one is left out." In a speech near the end of his life, he added that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. To achieve these ideals, the New Deal altered the relationship between government, business, and individual Americans.